now 1:16 when we'll finish at 2:16. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the government announced plans to have the Deputy Ministers of Health and Justice, as well as the CEO of Capital Health, head an inquiry into the release of Andre Noel Denny. It is worrying that the departments at the centre of this matter are the ones investigating it, Mr. Speaker. If someone acted inappropriately, these departments would have to point the finger at themselves. So my question to the Premier, will the Premier commit to an independent investigation of this matter?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this is a review of the process and procedures that took place to determine whether or not they're adequate. Who better to do that than the departments themselves?
Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, yesterday the departments didn't even know the location of a third person who did not return on time. The ministers didn't even seem to know that there was a third person missing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the ministers responsible had no desire to explore the possibility of temporary changes to protocols while the investigation was underway. The Health Minister also said that media advisory of these matters were not issued, Mr. Speaker, in the past that they had been. Mr. Speaker, the government is creating a new organization to investigate the police. They don't think that police should investigate themselves, but they think that the government department should. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier, if he doesn't believe that police departments should investigate themselves, why does he believe the Department of Justice and Health should investigate themselves?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, first of all, the information that he just gave was wrong. The Minister of Health never said that there were media advisories with respect to previous non-compliance with return after passes. This is a procedural matter on which there is a federally constituted board with respect to a discharge of a patient. It spans two departments and an outside agency. That procedural inquiry is best handled by those parties.
Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this is a serious matter, and to have the Departments of Health and Justice investigate themselves is not appropriate, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians want to make sure it was whatever breakdown in protocol happened, we would get to the bottom of it. As the Premier so rightly pointed out, the federal government is also involved in this, Mr. Speaker. We need an independent investigation to ensure that we get to the bottom of what broke down during this release. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, in a disposition order for Mr. Denny, I want to read a quote from it. The board concluded that Mr. Denny is a significant threat to the safety of the public, but will grant a conditional discharge as the least restrictive disposition that is appropriate in the circumstances, end of quote. Mr. Speaker, this disposition order was sent to the Director of Mental Health Services at Capital Health. But Capital Health will be helped leading this investigation, Mr. Speaker. This is why I believe it's important that we have an independent person looking at what broke down in this situation. So my question to the Premier, will he appoint an independent investigation to ensure that Nova Scotians can have faith in the findings of this report?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, we will continue with the inquiry that we have announced, the purpose of which is to see if there is any reason for us to go any further, Mr. Speaker. This is a circumstance that clearly is tragic, clearly is difficult circumstances both for the family of Mr. Tavel, but also, of course, for the family of the individual who now finds themselves in custody. What we are seeking to understand, I think, as all Nova Scotians are, and to get answers to, are the question of whether or not the procedures that were in place were adequate, whether or not they were followed, and if so, if not, are there improvements that can be made, or is this a case where everything that happened in accordance with the best practices, but still had a tragic result?
Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the government did not have information available about how many clients of the East Coast Forensic Unit were out on unsupervised leave this past week, the week of the tragic murder. It seemed like an obvious question to ask of the government, but yesterday was a very sad day, so now the government's had another 24 hours. I will ask the Premier, can he now tell the House how many people who are clients of the East Coast Forensic Unit were out on unsupervised leave this past week?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, they're patients. And they're right across the province. No, I don't know how many are out on day passes today. I don't.
Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that Nova Scotians would like to know the answer to that question because it is, in fact, a matter of public safety, and I certainly accept that the proper terminology is patient. So I will ask this question then. Of those patients of the East Coast Forensic Unit that were out on unsupervised leave, how many were out beyond the allowable leave time?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, my understanding is yesterday that there was 3 from the East Coast Forensic Unit. As I said, they are patients. This is not an unusual occurrence. Of course, there is a protocol for advising the police when people do not return as they are expected to, but I'm sure, like many other Nova Scotians, I heard the interview with the director of the facility yesterday, who said that this is not unusual, that in most cases, all of them return. Some of them return within 15 or 20 minutes because they've missed a bus or there is some other reason for their delay. But that their record of coming back and participating in the appropriate discharge plan is actually very, very high.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate we are now getting somewhere. The answer is 3. I appreciate that. I will ask the Premier, of those 3 that were out on unsupervised leave beyond their allotted time, are all 3 accounted for now?
Honourable the Premier.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, they are, and they were all accounted for within, I think, 24 hours.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Yesterday, during question period, the Premier showed the priority he places on mental health. In reference to program cuts for children and youth mental health services, the Premier stated, and I quote, "The changes that you talk about were designed to do just exactly that. It also was designed to take existing resources and apply them more effectively to ensure that more people get better access to care." Mr. Speaker, I'll table that. Nowhere in the statement did the Premier indicate that mental health programs would have a significant investment to the job that needs to be done. So my question to the Premier, will this government continue to nickel and dime the investment in mental health strategy, or will they simply cut valuable mental health programs in order to pay for it?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have, in fact, protected all of the mental health budgets, but we have also been leaders in the establishments of programs in mental health, such as the mental health courts. We have increased, or we have created the psychiatric intensive care unit, which is 6 beds, and there are numerous other examples of where this government has taken a leadership role with respect to mental health.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Speaker, and they removed adolescent mental health workers at the IWK, Mr. Speaker, and transferred that to the Valley. Well, that's what we're talking about, Mr. Speaker. There's no additional funding. What they're doing is moving program around, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in an affidavit from Janice Paul, the mother of Andre Denny, she commented on the lack of cultural sensitivity in the mental health system. She complained about the lack of options in medication. She complained about the lack of supports once her son would return home. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, these statements have been echoed by families right across this province attempting to access a variety of mental health services. So my question to the Premier, why have the cries of Nova Scotia families seeking mental health services over the last 3 years fallen on deaf ears?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, you know, for 20 years, nothing happened on mental health services at all, Mr. Speaker. Since this government has come to power, we have shone a light on mental health services. We have made progress in terms of ensuring that this is a priority for government. And, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that we have looked at programming and looked at the best way to ensure that the resources that we have actually provide services to the people who need it most. I cannot believe that the Leader of the Opposition would not agree with that.
The Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Speaker, there is no question. There is absolutely no question in this province that mental health services have not received the attention for a very, very long time, Mr. Speaker, but this government and this Premier have been in power for 3 years. They've increased the budget to the mental health services by 0.09%, Mr. Speaker, less than $3 million. Mr. Speaker, but they've added an additional $50 million to the industrial expansion slush fund, Mr. Speaker, that used it. For God's sakes, Mr. Speaker, they've spent $500,000 to buy lunch bags to give to kids, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is, why is a political slush fund and lunch bags more important than funding mental health services?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, no such thing. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we are providing services to people who need it most. I would note that when the critic for the Liberal Party was the Minister of Education, she had exactly the same kind of program. I think they used tote bags then to put the materials in. Mr. Speaker, it was the same thing because we're trying to get materials into the hands of young people so that they can complete and have a leg up on literacy. That is important, Mr. Speaker. We are focused on ensuring that the money that we have, the limited resources we have, because we pay $1 billion a year in interest on debt run up by those parties, is actually used. The money we have is used to provide good services.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on a new question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, parents of children with special needs are particularly concerned. The Minister of Education stood in this House and said repeatedly she supports students with special needs despite slashing funding for student supports. On Wednesday, Mr. Speaker, Public Accounts in an agenda-setting meeting, government members blocked a discussion on special needs funding. Mr. Speaker, actions speak louder than words. I hope the Premier will answer this question in the House and so that the parents with children with special needs will have an answer. My question to the Premier, why did government members on Public Accounts block a discussion on special needs funding?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, special needs funding has, of course, been protected, and the important thing for parents of special needs children to know is that they have a champion for their children in the Minister of Education.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what they're feeling is that they have a government who is blocking an open debate in a committee that would allow them to zero in on funding for children with special needs. Mr. Speaker, they recognize it is this government that has cut $65 million from public education. Mr. Speaker, they also recognize it is this government and that Minister of Education that has increased administrative costs in the Department of Education. Mr. Speaker, they also know it is this government that is forcing boards to cut teachers and educational assistants. Mr. Speaker, they also know it is this government that does not support children with special needs. My question to the Premier, when can parents expect this government to stand up for students with special needs and instead of reciting speaking notes and trying to block a discussion in Public Accounts?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, there was just a full opportunity for members of this House on the estimates of the Minister of Education to examine fully any aspect of that budget with respect to special education. It's why we have the mechanisms that we have here in the House. But the uncomfortable and inconvenient truth is that the members opposite know that it is this government that protects special needs funding for kids. It is this government that has them first and foremost in our minds when we develop programming, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, is that government that is blocking senior staff in the Department of Education to come here to Public Accounts to, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, Quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, to answer questions that the Minister of Education was unable to answer here during the estimate period that the Premier is talking about, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, school boards are being forced to cut teachers. They're being forced to cut educational assistants. We should be allowed to debate this issue on the floor of the House of Assembly, Mr. Speaker. And we should be allowed, as opposition members, to call anyone before public accounts to get to the bottom of decisions that this government is unwilling to answer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is the same government that spent $90,000 on TV ads, Mr. Speaker. This is the same government that spent $500,000, Mr. Speaker, on lunch bags and is unwilling to debate special needs education on the floor of this. Mr. Speaker, when will the Premier tell parents when his plans to make students with special needs a priority, Mr. Speaker, and not promotions?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, just in case anyone watching at home believes anything that is said by the Leader of the Opposition, they should know, Mr. Speaker, that the senior officials of the Department of Education were here in the House of Assembly during the education estimates. They could have asked any question they wanted with respect to education. He's critical today, Mr. Speaker. He's critical today of the government's advertising program, but I would like to table a press release from the Leader of the Opposition in which he was critical of the lack of promotion of programs. He says, McNeil argues the NDP is failing to promote the program because they are trying to find savings through decreased participation. Mr. Speaker, do they like us to promote programs or don't they?
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the clock is now ticking down officially on a very serious strike at Capital Health involving 3,600 important healthcare workers. The Capital Health is already closing beds. They are scaling back on services like blood collection. Surgeries are being cancelled in anticipation of a strike. The Premier left Metro Halifax without transit services for over 44 days. My question to the Premier, how many days will the Premier allow a strike at Capital Health to go on before he steps in to ensure proper patient care?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is, as the member opposite knows, a collective bargaining process underway now. It is at a very sensitive point, and we are hopeful that soon the parties will get back together. They'll resume some bargaining, and we hope there will be a resolve to this in a reasonable manner, and I'm sure that the Leader of the Conservative Party would wish that as well.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we can all hope, but the job of a Premier is actually to plan and be ready to ensure that patient services are open. I'd ask the Premier, Mr. Speaker, to consider the case of Lisa Morehouse, a 39-year-old mother who was diagnosed, unfortunately and very sadly, with stage 3C uterine cancer. She's had her surgery and is on the list for fast-track radiation and chemotherapy at Capital Health 2 weeks from now. Now, that procedure is at risk, Mr. Speaker. So on top of dealing with this awful disease, she now has to worry about whether she's going to get the treatments that she needs. So my question to the Premier, can the Premier assure Lisa Morehouse and the hundreds of others like her that she will get the treatment that she needs and deserves?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, obviously I can't speak to individual cases. I think that it would be obviously an inappropriate thing for me to do. What I can say is that there is an emergency services agreement in place that is designed to provide access to those services throughout a strike, very much like the one that was described by the Leader of the Conservative Party.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I guess the answer is no. The Premier can't provide Lisa Morehouse and the hundreds of others like her with that assurance. But certainly they deserve to know that their services and their treatments will be there for them when they need them, and that they will not be used as pawns in a negotiation between the government and its unions. So my question to the Premier is this: will he at least stand up and tell people who are on those lists for surgery, like Lisa Morehouse, that he is ready to do everything necessary to keep those services going?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, perhaps the leader of the opposite or leader of the Conservative Party didn't hear my response, but what I said is that there is a comprehensive emergency services agreement in place between the union and Capital Health designed to provide those kinds of emergency services like the one that he has talked about. I can't obviously, and it would be inappropriate to speak to individual cases, especially when of course he has provided nothing in the way of a background document about it. But Mr. Speaker, I want Nova Scotians to understand that we are, working very hard to try and come to a reasonable, negotiated agreement that the parties are at the table. They both know that they have our support. We want them to get back to the table. They both know that we are pledged to give whatever support we can to help them to get there and to resolve this in a reasonable fashion.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Education. Yesterday, in a response to a question, the Minister took exception to the use of the word lunch bag when speaking about her initiative for 4-year-olds. So my question to the Minister is this. What are the bags called in the most recent tender?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. The Play, Talk and Learn resources that are being distributed to all of our preschool students as they come into primary registration are housed in an insulated lunch bag. It is the resources. The resource is called Play, Talk and Learn.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The language that's being used, lunch bags, comes directly from the tender document, which refers to them as a request for standing offer for children's lunch bags. So, Mr. Speaker, the minister has no one to blame but herself for the term lunch bag. But, Mr. Speaker, the decision is much more important than the name. When resources are limited, when services to students are being cut, when teaching positions and other support positions are being reduced, when the anti-bullying strategies are being delayed, Nova Scotians are disappointed that this minister has not identified students in public schools as her priority. So my question to the minister is this. How can the minister justify to those students and parents that her priority to purchase lunch bags over funding programs and services is the right decision?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have a program that we're making sure that our preschool students have the resources that they need before they come to school. The Play, Talk and Learn resources include books. It has music. I could go on to what's in it, but the organization of the resources that are in the bag came from the determination of our reading specialists to replace the Welcome to School bag that the member from Colchester North signed off on in 2006 and 7 that went into the school board of CCRSB, Tri-County CSAP. The next year in 2007-8, it did include Halifax. So 4 school boards from the year 2006 to the year 2009 received Welcome to School bags at the tune of $32 a resource. This government has expanded upon making sure that these are resources that actually meet the needs of our students. They cost $35 a resource. They have the resources that are appropriate to learning. This is for every student in the province of Nova Scotia when they come to school.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And perhaps if the minister wanted to check those years when those resources were purchased, there was no cut to funding to the classroom. Mr. Speaker, once again, the minister is hiding behind school boards, saying that they asked for the bags. When school boards were contacted, not one board said that they had asked for the lunch bag. Rather, Mr. Speaker, the boards are looking at the purchasing power of $500,000. That, Mr. Speaker, could be 8 teachers, could be 16 education assistants, could be 20 librarian technicians, or it could be 20,000 lunch bags. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are shaking their head over this minister's decision. So my question to the minister is this. Knowing she made the wrong decision and knowing the tender closing date is not until April 27th, will the minister now make the right decision, withdraw the request for lunch bags, and put the money where it belongs, in the classroom?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. One of the most important things we can do is to make sure that our students are going to be successful in school. This has been identified by the reading specialists in every single one of our boards across this province. The member opposite is wrong in saying that the school boards were not consulted or did not want these. This is a component of succeeding in reading. We're making sure we're reaching our students. These are the resources that have been identified by our reading specialists of making sure that our students are going to be successful. In a perfect world, all children would have the materials available to them. But our society has changed, and especially people that live in poverty do not have all the resources available to them. We are making sure that every preschool child in the province of Nova Scotia and their families have the benefit of the appropriate resources. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday during question period, the Minister of Community Services said, and I quote, "There are no specific individual accusations," unquote, contained in the Talbot House organizational review. She also said, and again I quote, "It was not an individual review whatsoever without any accusations in there," unquote. And Mr. Speaker, I'll table that. My question through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister. Could the Minister please tell the House whether or not she's read the report in question?
Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, definitely I've read it.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll table the report from the Minister just so I can be sure that the Minister and I are talking about the same report. A disclaimer on the beginning page says, I quote, "This report is for the use of the board and is submitted to Talbot House in confidence." It goes on to say, "The report contains confidential and identifiable personal information and provides a strong warning that the Board of Talbot House consult with legal counsel before disclosing the report beyond the intended audience or making any use of the report or its contents other than for the purposes of assisting the board to improve organization and operations of the facility." I guess the Minister must have skipped over that disclaimer, Mr. Speaker, when she sat down to read the report. So my question through you to the Minister, why did the Minister allow the report to be published for all to see on the internet this week when at the time of the report was written, her department was so determined its contents be kept confidential?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, what we did is we kept very good communications with the Board of Directors. We had public requests for that review through the media, and because of the fact that we are a transparent government, we made the decision to put it on the website, but the board knew that.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, if the Minister had read the report, she would have noticed there is direct references to Father Paul Abbas's character and behaviour. By my count, there are 9 such references, and it should be noted, Mr. Speaker, as to the way these references are presented. So my final question to the Minister, in light of the callous way the Minister's department has treated Father Abbas's reputation, will the Minister do the right thing and apologise to Father Abbas?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. Any reference in that review is with respect to the organizational workings of that board of directors and not what they're trying to imply. It was to look at to see if they were meeting the standards in the service agreement. And let me also say that when I came in as minister in 2009, I was absolutely shocked that most of the service providers in this government through community service did not have any contracts or service agreement. This one was developed in 2008. So for years and years and years, that group over there wrote checks with no accountability back to the taxpayers of this province.
The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, last year on April 21st, nearly a year ago today, the Minister of Education stood in this House and said the following about her funding cuts, and I quote, "I trust that the impact will not be felt in the classroom," end of quote. And I'll table a copy of Hansard, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister to check. My question to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, can the Minister stand in this House today and say the same thing about this year and her latest round of funding cuts?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to remind everyone that we have increased the student funding. Per-child funding has increased in this province. As the school boards go through their budgets, they have been instructed to make sure that the classroom is protected. Thank you.
The honourable member for Clare on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister forgot to inform the House that public education in Nova Scotia is the second lowest in all of our country. That's what she should say. Mr. Speaker, boards are starting to approve their budgets for the upcoming school year, and they are forced to make some tough decisions because of this government. The Tri-County Regional School Board would not say the impact of this minister's cut will not be felt in the classroom. In fact, the board superintendent said, and I quote, "Any reductions will have impacts on services and supports the school," end of quote. And I'll table a copy of that article, Mr. Speaker. This year's cuts, coupled with inflation and cost of living, amounted to $2.5 million reduction in budget this year alone. Boards are already cut to the core after last year's cut. So again, to the Minister, will the Minister tell members of this House today where she thinks $2.5 million in savings can be cut, where it will not impact students in the classroom?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. Boards were given a mandate around their budgets. We are asking all boards to make sure that resources and the classroom is protected, and they are to look at administration, consultants in those areas to make sure that the classroom is protected. We are making sure that the resources match the needs of our students. We have declining enrollment, we have increasing per student spending, and our ratio is the lowest it's been ever in the province. Thank you.
The honourable member for Clare on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Tri-County Regional School Board is looking at cutting 11 teaching positions. And I repeat for the Minister to hear, they're looking at cutting 11 teaching positions as part of their budget cutting process this year. Losing these teaching positions means larger class sizes, less class offerings, and less support for our students, of course. The students that need the most support are the most vulnerable, Mr. Speaker, to this minister's callous cut. Mr. Speaker, parents in the Tri-County area are looking to this minister to be an education leader, and instead she's gutting the supports and services students rely on. So again, will the minister stand up for students in the Tri-County Regional School Board and admit her cuts are affecting the classroom and restore funding to education, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. We definitely are making sure that students in the Tri-County are protected. Their decreased enrollment is 3.2, and we made sure that that their budget was capped in at 2. But I just want to remind everybody that we are standing up for every child in this province, and we have a plan. Children, kids, and learning first, and we are making sure that the resources match the needs of our changing society. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question through you will be to the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, in the last few weeks, we have had serious questions about the department's handling of the situation and risk at East Preston Daycare and the safety of the children there. Mr. Speaker, this week, serious questions about the department's handling of Talbot House have emerged. My question, Mr. Speaker, through you to the Minister of Community Services is, will the Minister commit to having a full, independent, operational review of her department?
Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, we followed absolutely every process that we have the authority to process, so the answer is no.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on his first supplementary.
Well, I'm shocked and appalled at that answer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister stonewalled on the East Preston Daycare Centre. She talked about everything, Mr. Speaker, everything but the safety of the children. And she's stonewalling on Talbot House and showing blatant disregard for the reputation of Father Paul Abbas. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister is this. Why is an operational review on Talbot House okay, but not for the minister's department?
Of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, I was very clear in the safety of the children because we have the jurisdiction in these type of situations to investigate current allegations, which we did. There was no evidence, so the RCMP has the right to investigate historical allegations. They just can't seem to get it. And it's also very interesting that the only one that's bringing up the name in this House is that party over there that's causing the trouble.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can say as a parent and as a grandparent that there's not a single Nova Scotian that would accept that answer from that minister when it regards children's safety. You know, Mr. Speaker, if this minister's not up to the job, maybe it's time that the Premier put someone in there that can do the job. My question for the minister is this. I'll ask again. In light of 2 serious abuses of power by that department, why not put the department through the same kind of operational review that the minister imposed on Talbot House and all those reputable people that are on the board of directors at that centre?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, the fact is the organizational review was not something that was just focused on Talbot House. We have done a number of organizational reviews, and within the organizational reviews, there will be things that will come out because of the fact that we want to improve services between that organization and ourselves.
The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Mr. Speaker, this government is overseeing tuition increases, student fee increases, and massive cuts to post-secondary education funding. Under the NDP's watch, $75 million was slashed from post-secondary education in the province. On April 12, 2004, the Transportation Minister, in his role as the opposition's education critic, said, and I quote, "Here it is again. They are trying to balance the books on the backs of students," end quote. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Transportation Minister is, the minister thought slashing the funding to universities was awful in 2004. Why does he support removing $75 million from the system today?
That's not within the minister's portfolio, so I would ask the Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education to answer that question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. as I have said on the floor of this chamber before, we are attempting to provide for the sustainability of our post-secondary system in this province, particularly the universities. We have 11 excellent institutions, but certainly they need to be innovative. They need to make sure that they are meeting the needs of Nova Scotians as well as the fiscal capacity of Nova Scotians, and that period of transition and transformation is currently underway. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the fact is that education is getting more expensive under this government. NSCC was forced to increase tuition and lay off staff. DAL was forced to increase tuition and student fees. And on April 12th, I want to quote the Minister of Transportation again. He said, "I challenge the Minister of Education to reassure the public that this government is not considering hiking tuition fees at NSCC in the upcoming budget." End quote. My question for the Minister, it wasn't okay for the Conservatives to hike tuition at NSCC. Why is it okay for the NDP?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It became very obvious when we became government in 2009 that the status quo was not sustainable in this province. And we have carefully examined every sector. We are making strategic investments to improve our economy and also to invest in our human resources, including our students. And I am very proud of our track record in terms of our incredible improvements to student assistance and increasing opportunities for training and learning within this province. Thank you.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope the minister gets used to improving the affordability measures, because we're going to need them if tuition keeps going up in the province of Nova Scotia. The only thing that's become obvious is this government's disrespect for the education system in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to quote the Minister of Transportation again from December 8, 2004. How can Newfoundland, economically very much like this province, put a freeze on and subsequently in the last 4 years actually reduce fees by 22.7%, end quote. Mr. Speaker, the minister added, that takes some political guts. And this is a government that hasn't demonstrated much of it today, Mr. Speaker. My question to the minister is, why does this government attack university spending instead of showing some political guts and investing in the future of this province?
Order, please. Order, please. The word guts is unparliamentary. I would ask the honourable member to retract that word, please.
I retract that quote and will replace it with intestinal fortitude, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I will now ask the Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is actually investing $48 million new into post-secondary education in terms. I'm giving the answer. I know the facts. We are putting.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government has added $48 million new to the base of university education, and that's not even taking into account the Excellence and Innovation Fund of $25 million. We are being strategic in investing in students and investing in the capacity of universities to be able to do innovative initiatives in order to share services, reduce expenses, and focus as much money as possible on the education of our students. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Preston.
Mr. Speaker, last Thursday, in response to a question, the Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations stated that there would be no tax increases as a result of the NDP's reversal on the MOU. In fact, he went on so far to say, tax rates have gone down in HRM and basically across the province. We are quite pleased with that result, and I'll table that. Comments from Hansard. My question to the minister is, will the minister verify his comments from last week that municipal residents will experience no tax increases?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The municipalities, depending on what project or extra service they may want to add on from one year to the other. But in terms of the assessment across the province, actually the cap is at 3.9. Assessment across the province is an average of 6%, so actually above the cap. So therefore, and the minister or the member may notice in today's paper that no tax increase in Kings County and actually HRM as well. So.
The Honourable Member for Preston.
Mr. Speaker, we know that the region of Queens has increased its commercial, residential and resource property tax rates by 3%. We're hearing from other municipalities from across the province who are struggling with the decision this minister, as a result of this minister tearing up the MOU. And I have a document here from the Nova Scotia Chronicle Herald dated April 18th, in which it states that the municipality of Queens has raised taxes as a result of the MOU being destroyed. My question to the minister, in addition to the region of Queens, does the minister know which other municipalities are faced with the prospect of having to raise taxes to make up for the shortfall created by the NDP?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, look, like I said, depending on what projects certain municipalities may take on, certainly in Queens and at their request, they wanted to have a cut in the taxes for Bowater. So if they increase their rate for their citizens to make up for that, that's their business, not ours. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the assessments across the province are up. Municipalities have not increased their rates, so if assessments are up and the rates stay the same, the tax bills would have increased. That's their business. That's not as a result of the MOU.
The Honourable Member for Preston on his final supplementary.
Well, evidently the minister did not read the article in the paper where the Mayor of Queens clearly stated that as a result of the MOU being torn up, taxes did increase by 3%. Mr. Speaker, Queens has had to raise its tax rates to make up for the shortfall that was created by the minister tearing up the MOU. We are also hearing from Colchester and Stewiacke and others that are facing similar shortfalls on their books as a result of the MOU. This is putting service delivery at risk at the same time as it becomes likely that more and more Nova Scotians will be paying higher property taxes as a result of the removal of this MOU. My question to the minister is, will the minister revisit his decision to tear up the MOU and reconsider his refusal to share service agreements?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, I'm really pleased that the member opposite was a municipal councillor, because maybe at some point he'll pick up on the message I'm trying to give him. The member doesn't seem to understand that the costs under the MOU are the same costs that those municipal units have been paying for some 15 years now. They're not additional costs. Matter of fact, they're costs imposed by the previous Liberal government that he was a member of. Now, Mr. Speaker, an increase in assessment would allow the municipal units to have an increase in income, and they've decided to take advantage of the increase in assessment for greater dollars from their constituents. That's something that municipal councillors will have to defend with their own electorate in the months to come, Mr. Speaker. But the members should also understand that the MOU that was signed, they signed the entire MOU, including the clause that allowed the province to move out of the MOU, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, recently the Minister of Energy couldn't answer how much a kilowatt-hour of electricity from Muskrat Falls will cost our ratepayers, or what the cost is of a kilowatt-hour of wind. This is information the Minister needs to know, Mr. Speaker. I don't believe the Minister increased her renewable targets and hasn't at least done some rough estimates of the cost of each renewable sources. Will the Minister table by the end of the day the estimates by his department done on the cost of a kilowatt-hour of electricity for ratepayers from various renewable sources that were used to make the decision to increase these targets?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the honourable member for his question. Certainly, we're all interested in the least expensive cost of electricity in our province. We know it's important for our homeowners and small businesses and industry as well. We're looking at a portfolio approach in our province, looking at renewables, looking at the importance of natural gas, hydroelectricity from Newfoundland and Labrador, and all of those together gives us stability that we're not going to be dependent on coal. We've been dependent on coal for the last number of years. In fact, it was one time 75% of our cost increase has really influenced us. So that's why we're getting away from coal, getting onto renewables and more energy conservation.
The Honourable Member for Hants West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all want more renewable energy, but it has to be done at a pace families and business can afford, Mr. Speaker. It's the Minister's job to know how much each of these resources cost and to protect families and businesses from skyrocketing energy costs. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Energy: will the Minister admit he did not do a socioeconomic study of how much families and businesses can afford when he raised the targets?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, the source of renewable electricity from Newfoundland and Labrador is an important part of our energy mix, and the Newfoundland and Labrador government is looking at the cost and the environmental assessment and the job benefits of that project. And certainly, when the time comes, our UARB here will determine, looking at the capital costs, the benefits to Nova Scotians, and the rate of return, and as well as the renewable energy for the next 35 years. So the UARB will use all the expertise from Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as their own expertise, to come up with the right decision for Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Hants West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has nothing, obviously, no proof of anything. When he was asked recently about the research that was done to make the target decision, the Minister said he consulted Nova Scotians. Opinion research is hardly enough for a decision of this magnitude, Mr. Speaker, especially where no costs were secured. The Minister is failing in his responsibility to protect our families and our businesses in this province, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister table the supporting information that was used to make the decision to increase the renewable targets? Or maybe the Premier wants to challenge it.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The CEO of Emera has stated that the cost of renewable electricity from Newfoundland and Labrador on the Muskrat Falls project will be comparable in price to other renewables, and that's a good positive statement, that it'll be comparable to other renewables, and it's going to give us the best possible energy prices for the next 35 years at very stable prices. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with the federal budget, the Harper Conservatives announced changes to old age security, which will see the age of eligibility raised from 65 to 67. This change will have a direct impact on seniors in our province. To quote from a recent report from the Canadian Centre on Policy Alternatives, quote, raising the age of eligibility for GIS to age 67 would have a negative impact on the incomes of all seniors in the age 65 to 67 age bracket. But by far, the greatest impact would be on those who have little or no retirement savings and limited benefits from the Canada Pension Plan. My question to the Premier is, what discussions has the Premier had with the Prime Minister regarding these changes and the negative impact that it will have on Nova Scotia seniors?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we're of course acutely aware of any change in the rules with respect to OAS and the way or the manner in which they might impact on Nova Scotia. And as the member opposite knows, these changes, although they've been announced, are some years out in their implementation and in their effect. But let me assure you that this government does everything it can to protect our seniors from cost increases. It's one of the reasons why we undertook things like taking the HST off of home energy and a host of other things that are really designed just to make life a little bit easier for our seniors.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we're acutely aware of some of the increases that this government has put on electricity bills, gasoline, cost of food, extra taxes through HST, so I'm glad that the government is thinking of affordability for once. They're not doing it. Mr. Speaker, even if these changes are some years out, Nova Scotians are making plans themselves for retirement, and they are concerned about the impacts that this is going to have. Nova Scotians need to know that their concerns are being heard in Ottawa. These changes will definitely have a negative impact on all seniors, and it will particularly target those with the lowest incomes and those that do physically demanding jobs. My question to the Premier is, what steps has the Premier taken to ensure that the concerns of Nova Scotian seniors have been heard and understood in Ottawa now?
Here.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the member opposite might know, the Council of Federation will actually be meeting here in Nova Scotia in July. These issues and the approach to them are always part of the agenda. We made the point going into the last budget that we were concerned about these types of initiatives, their impact on our citizens, and therefore the impact ultimately on the budgets of the province. But I'm pleased to say that in Ottawa, the fight with respect to the old age security and with respect to these issues is being ably taken forward by Thomas Mulcair, by Megan Leslie, by Peter Stauffer, and by Robert Chisholm.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would hope that the government and the Premier of this province aren't sitting on their hands allowing others to speak for Nova Scotian problems. It's their job, it's the Premier's job to go and represent seniors in this province. To quote again from the report, which I'm happy to table in case the government has not read it, delaying the age of eligibility for OAS will result in significantly reduced incomes for those who are unable to replace OAS income from earnings in low-wage jobs. Mr. Speaker, we all know that we have a lot of people working in low-wage jobs in this province. And Mr. Speaker, there's a great concern throughout the province over these changes. Nova Scotians are angry at the Harper Conservatives for imposing these, and they are disappointed in the Premier not standing up for them. My question to the Premier is, why is the Premier not standing up to the Harper Conservatives, telling them that these changes are unacceptable and that they will hurt Nova Scotians?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, to the contrary, the federal government knows full well what our concerns are. But, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of things that we want to do. First of all, we want to make sure that we move people out of low-wage jobs into better-paying jobs. So, Mr. Speaker, they aren't reliant on it. That's why we have projects on the horizon, like the Lower Churchill, like the ships contract, like, Mr. Speaker, the investment in the offshore. It's why we're investing in skills, trades, training for young people, so that by the time they get to retirement age, they're going to have good jobs with pensions, with incomes, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, 15 years ago, when this work should have been done by a Liberal government, it wasn't.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West. Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, Michelin will add 500 jobs in South Carolina, invest $750 million to expand its operation there because the state is seen as pro-business. Mr. LeBlanc of Michelin said that Nova Scotia's new labour law doesn't help him build a case for Nova Scotia in the future. And Mr. Speaker, in the last 3 years, the Annapolis Valley is down 4,400 jobs. The southern region is down 3,400 jobs. during the NDP mandate, the areas are collectively out about 7,800 jobs. Mr. Speaker, 500 good-paying, full-time Michelin jobs could do a lot to help the struggling Valley and South and Southern regions, but the NDP had to pay back their big Labour bosses. Mr. Speaker, my question is the Minister of Economic Rural Development and Tourism is, why won't the Minister admit that the NDP's Labour-friendly laws have failed the people of the Valley and the Southern region and hurt their chances of attracting Michelin's 500 jobs and $750 million in new investment?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural... Time has elapsed for oral questions by members. Sorry, I got carried away. It was that good today. I will now recognize the Honourable Host, the Government Host Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we should now leave the chair and help the whole House on supply.
Motion is carried. Before we go, I would like to... the Honourable Member for Kings North on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to call the attention of the House to the East Gallery. I've noticed that my former boss, Dr. John Campbell, is in the gallery, and I'm pleased to welcome him here. Dr. Campbell is the Director of Mental Health and Addiction Services for Annapolis Valley Health and does an awful lot to make the Annapolis Valley community a better place. And thank you for visiting, and I'm sure all of us will give him a warm welcome as we usually would.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in the West Gallery, I'd like to draw the members' attention to Mr. Alan Billard, who's here with the Shubenacadie Canal Commission today.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy today's proceedings. Motion is carried earlier. The Honourable Member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's with pleasure I stand today to talk in the motion to go into supply. You know, I've spoken this chamber many times about the financial crisis that for families, a better deal for today's families that this NDP government is imposing on Nova Scotians. And you know, the further it goes, and I've been called by the members across there the member of gloom and doom, and probably gloom and doom for their party the next election, when the people realize exactly why they don't have the money they used to have to spend on things, and because their income